Hey folks, welcome back to the shop and thanks for joining me for part 2 of the Grizzly unboxing and setup. If you remember from part 1, that machine had a pretty significant amount of damage and Grizzly wanted to send me replacement parts for that machine. But after going through it with a fine-tooth comb, I kind of came to the conclusion that there was just too much damage to it and that thing was never going to work right even with replacement parts. So to answer some of the questions from the first video, the process was fairly simple. I had to go around and around with Grizzly's customer service for about 2 or 3 days to finally get somebody who would send me a new machine. But in the end, they made it right, they took care of the problem, got me a new machine, and I think we're ready to go. So we're gonna go ahead and get started with the setup process. I've already got it unboxed. You know what that looks like. There's no need to go through that again. And once we got it set up and I run a couple test pieces, I'll go ahead and do a pros and cons, basically show you what I like about the machine, what I don't like, and hopefully that will help you make an informed decision if you decide to go with this particular model and Grizzly as well. Step 1. Remove the fence to allow full access to the table. You'll need a 3/4 inch socket to remove the retaining nut. Next, you're going to need to loosen and lower the top and bottom stops for both the tables so you can make your adjustments. You will need a 13mm wrench. Go ahead and lower the infeed table just a little so it's out of the way and you can make the necessary adjustments for the next part of the process. Now I'm going to check the outfeed table to make sure that it is coplanar with the cutter head. This will require a straight edge and feeler gauges. Note, you're not actually checking against the blades, but rather the cutter head drum itself. Now luckily, my outfeed table was coplanar within a couple thousandths, so no adjustments really needed. Notice, you'll need to do this on both sides of the table, as maybe the front or the back of the table may not be in coplanar. So check in the back and then move your straight edge and check the front as well. Now you can check coplanar between outfeed and infeed tables. Raise the infeed to the same height as the outfeed. Notice there may be a small gap and you may not get it exactly, so make note of that when you go to do your corrections. Because the straight edge I have is only 36 inches long, I will need to keep the infeed side weighted down so I can check the infeed against it. Using feeler gauges and a piece of paper, I can record the size of the gaps at all 4 corners of the infeed so I can make the appropriate adjustments. Again, repeat this process on the front and the back side of the table, as all 4 corners may not be exactly coplanar to each other. Luckily, I only had to make one small adjustment to one corner of the table, but it took a lot of tinkering to get it right, and I'm not going to bore you with the 30 minutes that took. Now that your tables are coplanar, you can set the final height of your outfeed table. To find the right height, set the straight edge on the outfeed table just above the blade. Slowly lower the outfeed and rotate the cutter head until the blade just catches the straight edge and pulls it forward about 1/8 to 1/4 inch. Lock down the table and set your height stops. Now I should mention with this model there are 4 high-speed steel cutting knives. This is not the spiral cutter. So I went ahead and repeated this process with all 4 knives in the drum just to make sure that they were all relatively cutting at the same height. Luckily, they were set pretty well from the factory. The next step is to set your cut depth on the infeed table. I didn't have a 1/32 feeler gauge, but I had an old machinist scale that was exactly .031. So I sanded down any rough edges and used this as a gauge. Using the straight edge on the outfeed as a reference point, lower the infeed until it is exactly 1/32 below the outfeed. Now, this model has a quick release stop in addition to the 2 stop bolts under the table. Set the quick release stop to 1/32, and I'll show you why in a minute. I'd also like to point out that I set my quick release stop at 1/32 because that's about the right distance you should be taking on a single pass for normal joiner operations. You really shouldn't be taking more than that in any one pass. As with most joiners, this model has a rabbiting function. This is why we haven't set our final depth stop yet. I didn't have a 1/2 inch gauge block, so I used a 1/2 inch piece of stock, measured it with some calipers, and made up the difference with feeler gauges. Following the same process as before, I will now use this block to set my final depth stop at a 1/2 inch below the cutter head. This is the max depth cut for the rabbiting function. Once all your adjustments have been made and you're happy with it, go ahead and set your depth stops. The last step in the process is to reinstall the fence and ensure that it's 90 degrees to the table. Now, I have an electronic angle finder that I got from Lowe's for about 10 bucks, and I set it to 0 on the cast iron tabletop of my table saw, which I'm pretty sure is flat enough. Now, as you can see, I'm having a little bit of difficulty here. There is a Allen key bolt on the back and the stop of the fence, and you're going to have to kind of fiddle fart around with this thing to get it exactly where you want. You might have to go over 90 degrees and then walk it back, which is basically what I ended up having to do. And finally, once you have your fence set to exactly 90 degrees, go ahead and reset all the stops and tighten everything back up. Alright guys, pros and con time. First thing I wanted to point out, which is something that I noticed with my research of other models, is the, come on focus, was the eccentric bushing and the set screw for that bushing. Now on the other models it appears that you've got a cap screw on top here with the set screw underneath it. With this particular model, it's just a set screw that holds the eccentric bushing in place. Now on this one, it seems like they took some customer complaints into consideration because they actually put what appears to be, you know, like a normal bolt head on this bushing so that you can get a wrench or some pliers around it. Now the problem that I ran into is that the biggest wrench I have is a 21 millimeter. Luckily, I have an old German set of sockets on hand, and I believe it's a 24 millimeter socket that fits this eccentric bushing head. So if you don't have a 24 millimeter socket, you're kind of out of luck, and you're just going to have to put some you know, some channel locks on this thing to move it. Now it doesn't take a whole lot of effort to move it, so you shouldn't, you know, be worried about boogering up your bushing head. So that shouldn't be a problem. But I just wanted to point that out because I noticed on a few other models they had some weird sort of you know, system on that eccentric bushing where you had to use what looked like C-clip pliers in order to move it back and forth. So all in all, I think that's a pro. It made it easy to set up, easy to adjust. Now, one of the things about this model that I really do not like is, and I didn't realize this when I was researching it, but all the other models that I've noticed, they've got 2 fixed wheels in the base of the cabinet and 1 wheel on a what's called like a lifting caster, and it has a swivel wheel on it. Now with this particular model, and you can't really see it, but there's 2 wheels on either end and they're fixed. So when you go to move this thing, you have to pick up one end of it and swivel it around to wherever you want it to go. This machine only freely moves back and forth. There is no side-to-side movement on it, excuse me. So if you don't have a designated home for your machine and you constantly have to wheel it back and forth to your power supply or to your dust collection like I do, it's going to get really old and really obnoxious. So in order to remedy that situation, I'm basically going to be forced to have to drop another 220 line on the other side of my shop so this thing isn't constantly having to be wheeled back and forth. The other thing I wanted to notice, or make you aware of, is the fence on this. There isn't really a stop for 45 degrees on this. You basically, here's your 90-degree stop, and you've got this little detent that flips back and forth. So you put this thing up in the 90-degree position, flip that down, and it hits that stop, and that's what keeps it at 90 degrees. And that's okay, because most of my cuts are going to be at 90 degrees. And to get it to 45, you basically just loosen it up, take that out of the way, and flip it back down. Now I was able to throw my little electronic angle finder on here. Oh, turn itself off. And with a little finessing, it moved on me. But I was able to get it right at 45 earlier, but I just don't like the fact that there's no set stop for 45, and you basically just have to play with it to get it where you want it. Not really a big fan of that. Dust collection on this thing works pretty well though, so that's a pro. And when I did finally end up getting my depth set, which you saw from the video before, this thing is actually set pretty closer, right at 1/32, but I wouldn't make any adjustments or estimates based on this. I would go ahead, follow the steps that I outlined in the video, and make sure that your depth is set right at 1/32. So don't put a whole lot of faith and stock into this. All in all, I've run a couple test pieces of some poplar that I had just laying around. After making 2 passes, it pulled out the wobble in that board that I had sitting pretty flat, so I'm pretty happy with that. There was a little bit of snipe, but after looking at it and reading through some of the manuals, I quickly realized that it was operator error on my part. So all in all, I'm pretty happy with this machine. As you can see over here, I've got a giant stack of maple that I'm getting ready to start processing to make a nice mid-century modern credenza. So now that I've got this machine set up, I think I'm ready to go ahead and start rocking and rolling on that, and that'll be the next series of videos that I make. So hopefully you found this informative. I hope this was of some use to you. If you like my video, if you find it informative, give me a like, give me a subscribe, and you'll definitely get to hear more from me later on. Thanks.